Back when my favorite metal bands only had a handful of albums each, I felt like I was a huge fan of theirs. But over the decades and with their growing catalogs, can I still call myself a fan? Well, to figure things out, I'm going to discuss 14 still popular classic metal bands, consider the discography's modern relevance to me, and really decide if I'm still a 100% fan of theirs, or maybe not as much. So, this should be a whole lot of fun. Stick around. So during the classic era, I was definitely all in with the bands I'm going to talk about. But through the decades, the musical landscape had changed, bands had changed, I'd changed. So given that, I thought it might be fun to revisit these bands that I was utterly crazy about to see if I'm still a huge fan or simply in love with a few classic records from each, and maybe that's it. So here's the scale I came up with, which we'll call the fan-o-meter, and why not? It ranges from not really a fan from 0 to 60%, to barely a fan from 60 to 69%, to a casual fan from 70 to 79%, to a fan from 80 to 100%. And of course, that brings us to the usual disclaimer. This is my somewhat loose ranking of albums and not necessarily yours. So I'm well aware of how subjective this entire video is, and so should you be. Anyways, with that, let's get to the bands. First up is W.A.S.P, formed in 1982 in Los Angeles. They were a key band during the first wave of hair metal, even if they were outliers of that scene with their heavier sound and scarier image. Led by Blackie Lawless, the band forges on through various lineup changes. Currently, they have a total of 15 studio albums. So my relationship with W.A.S.P is mostly concentrated on their 80s output. I know a lot of folks really like the Crimson Idol, and to some degree I do as well, but not as much. After that, there are way too many albums that suffer from lesser quality, though a few valiant attempts at better records with KFD, Dying for the World, and Babylon are out there. Sometimes there are a few scant tracks in the low-ranked albums that are somewhat decent, and Blackie's voice is always pretty solid, but the songcraft isn't consistent and the production suffers a bit as well. Given all of that, my ranking brings W.A.S.P to 33% out of 100, which means I'm not really a fan, but seriously love those first two albums, and more or less dig the three after that. Next is Ozzy Osbourne, who after his exit from Black Sabbath in 1979 formed his own solo act, initially called Blizzard of Oz. Osbourne also courted some controversy during the 1980s for his on- and off-stage antics, various lawsuits, and run-ins with religious groups. Currently, Ozzy has a total of 12 studio albums. So right away, let's just state the obvious here. The first two Ozzy albums are simply untouchable. And a lot of that has to do with the guitar work of Randy Rhoads, but also the shared songwriting by Rhoads and bassist Bob Daisley. Like in Sabbath, Ozzy wasn't the biggest contributor when it came to writing the songs and often left the musical heavy lifting to other bandmates. Even if he often took sole writing credit for tracks, which may or may not be just his idea. Hint, hint. For me, the dip really starts with The Ultimate Sin, which is fine and has a few standout tracks, but is a far cry from previous efforts. Same for the next two albums, despite the presence of a seriously decent guitarist. But that is really just diminishing returns from there, with the final four albums being rather unbearable. With that, the album ranking brings Ozzy to 46%, so not really a fan. But like W.A.S.P, those first two albums are beyond amazing. Also, rest in peace, Randy Rhoads. Next up is Manowar, formed in 1980 in the state of New York. Definitely one of the founding bands of the early US power metal scene, along with Virgin Steel and Jag Panzer. They're also a band that takes metal very, very seriously. Currently, Manowar has a total of 11 studio albums. So I came in on Into Glory Ride back in 1984, then quickly grabbed up the remaining albums. Love the 80s records, but also the Triumph of Steel from 1992, even though we already lost Ross the Boss and Scott Columbus at this point. But Joey is still writing most of the music at this point, so there's that. But when guitarist Carl Logan comes in, Joey shares some of the songwriting duties with him, and perhaps that might have influenced the material in what I consider a rather plodding and uneventful direction. Or maybe it's all of the retread in those last four albums. Perhaps made even more conspicuous by the sheer number of years between releases. It all starts to feel like a legacy band leaning way too much on their legacy and less on the actual songwriting. We'll love to see that change, but for now, the ranking puts them at 73%, which only makes me a casual fan. But I'd still go see them live, if given the chance. Next is Death, formed in 1983 under their original name Mantis. Easily one of the earliest and most influential bands in death metal, notably its first wave. Death has a total of 7 studio albums in their catalog. So in their 18 years of existence, the band certainly changed a little, bringing progressive elements more and more into their death metal sound. I mean, Voivod did it too, but shall we say, differently. But the proggier that Death got, the less I got excited about them. Of course, I still love both Spiritual Healing and Human because they are very strong death metal records. But starting with Individual Thought Patterns, I found myself visiting that later material less and less. Granted, there are still tracks on those last 3 records that I enjoy, but by then my days of getting really amped up for a death record had pretty much slowed to a crawl. So, because of that, my ranking totals to 79%, making me a casual fan, but just about on the cusp of being an actual fan by only 1 percentage point. And I feel the word almost really captures what I feel for the final 3 records. I just feel almost about them. Hopefully that makes some sense. Next up is Kreator, formed in 1982 in Essen, Germany, back when the band went by the name Tormentor. Kreator is one of the biggest thrash metal bands to come out of Germany, and shares that distinction with such acts as Destruction and Sodom. Currently, Kreator has a total of 15 studio albums. So I suppose, like a lot of bands on this list, we've got a strong run of albums to start, then a questionable mid-career, and something of a comeback over the last so many records. And Kreator definitely follows that path as well. After Coma Souls, the band retools their sound, and a lot of fans really weren't happy about it. But I actually liked Renewal, and still do to some degree, but it just wasn't the same. Endorama in particular really seemed to be the bottoming out for the band, but then Violent Revolution comes along and we get strong releases going forward, albeit with some power metal influence slipping in here and there. Granted, I don't like modern Kreator in the same way as the classic material, but I still do dig it a whole lot, which actually might surprise some folks who only stay with the 80s records from the band. With all of this, the ranking has Kreator at 83%, and so I'm an actual fan. Sounds about right. Next is Testament, formed in 1983 in the San Francisco Bay Area, where they were originally known as Legacy. The band was a major part of the second wave of thrash metal in the last half of the 1980s, alongside Violence, Death Angel, and Forbidden. Currently, Testament has a total of 12 studio albums. So the standard path here for Testament as well: killer albums until the early 90s, then a string of not as strong records until the 2000s, then a comeback album, and solid releases since. And even still, Testament has yet to release a completely shitty album, and I gotta say I really love everything from the formation of Damnation going forward, retaining much of what made them great in the classic era, including those still strong vocals from Chuck, and of course the twin guitar assault of Skolnick and Peterson. I'd say if you gave up on them around the time of The Ritual, you should really come back to this band. I mean, even to check out Low, Demonic, and The Gathering, which also have their strong suits, even if they're not up to the level where they are now. Because of this, the ranking has the band at 83% for me, so again, I'm a fan. Makes sense. Next up is Overkill, hailing from the great state of New Jersey and formed in 1980. A highly prolific and consistent thrash metal band that are incredibly relevant to this very day. Currently, Overkill has a total of 20 studio albums, definitely impressive for any legacy thrash band. So I should state that back in the 80s and early 90s, Overkill was my favorite thrash metal band. Yes, even more than Slayer. But again, like so many of these bands, things changed around 1993 with the uncertain course of the metal scene that came in the grunge period. And although I feel that Overkill never really gave us a terrible album, there was a dip in the catalog that lasted for over 15 years, if we're being honest here. But then Ironbound hit in 2010 and Overkill was definitely back in action. Really love the modern outfit from the band, all the way to the latest album. But sadly, the mid-career material drags things down a touch, so the ranking has Overkill at only 78%, making me a casual fan, with only a couple percentage points away from being an actual fan. But if the current trajectory continues, that could change for the better. It seems like it might. Definitely hopeful. Next is Exodus, formed in 1979 in Richmond, California, and one of the classic thrash metal bands to come out of the Bay Area scene. Currently, Exodus has a total of 11 studio albums. So, I've always had a mixed bag relationship with this band. I mean, when they're good, they're really good, but they also have a lot of okay material at best that dominates their catalog, starting with Impact is Imminent, which is fine but didn't hold up well over time. Force of Habit, of course, is a bit of a shit show, but then Tempo of the Dam brings them back. And then a series of decent, but not astounding records until Persona non grata in 2021, which is a killer record. Not Bonded by Blood killer, but still killer. So because of those merely serviceable records that weigh the catalog down a little, the ranking brings Exodus to a fairly low 68%, so barely a fan, though only a couple points away from casual fandom. That's kind of sad because these first three records are solid classics that should be in every thrash fan's collection, hoping to keep things going from their 2021 album and retain some of that reacquired strength. I think they could do it. Next up is Iron Maiden, formed in 1975 in London, England, and not only one of the most notable acts of the new wave of British heavy metal scene, but also one of the most celebrated bands in the entire history of the genre. Currently, Iron Maiden has a total of 17 studio albums. So this is one of those bands that, were I to not think too much about it, I might just claim them to be one of my very favorite metal bands. But if I'm being honest with myself, that would be based solely on their first 5 or 6 albums, all of which masterpieces. But there are 11 other albums in their catalog, ranging from passable to simply boring, and that's really sad to say about a truly classic and groundbreaking legacy metal band. For me, it starts with Seventh Son, which has a few strong tracks but is less consistent when compared to previous efforts. That lack of consistency is further evident in the next 2 records, but then the bottom falls out with the Blaze Bayley albums. Then they return with a slew of competent albums that at the same time lack a lot of the charm and punch of early material, not to mention tracks getting longer and longer, which only emphasizes that absence of luster. They're not awful records, and they have their moments at times, but they're not great either, and I don't think it's unreasonable to expect greatness from this particular band given their classic era. So the ranking has Iron Maiden at 62%, so I'm barely a fan at this point. Next is Judas Priest, formed in 1969 in Birmingham, England, featuring the siren screams of the metal god himself, Mr. Rob Halford. And like Maiden, Judas Priest had truly made a profound mark on the history of heavy metal. Currently, Judas Priest has a total of 19 studio albums. So I always had less problems with Priest than I do Maiden. Figured that one out a long time ago. I generally prefer the former a bit more, and even if the playing fields of both bands are kind of similar, I mean, both have sizable catalogs, both are British, both are revered as important bands, and both had a brief change out in vocalists at some point. But the difference for me is that Priest made fewer mistakes. I mean, out of the 19 studio albums, I outright love 13 of them, as opposed to only 6 of the 17 Maiden records. Even Judas Priest's okay albums have some truly shining moments on them. I could even say that Turbo, Ram It Down, and Nostradamus aren't entire losses by any stretch. Of course, Demolition can go straight into the trash, but that's about it. Also, unlike Maiden, I'm generally excited about the modern era of Judas Priest, with both Firepower and Invincible Shield being incredible heavy metal albums. So yeah, Priest over Maiden for me. Anyways, with all of that, I'm giving Judas Priest a ranking of 82%, making me an actual fan, which isn't any real surprise for me. I mean, Priest rules. Next is Megadeth, formed in 1983 in Los Angeles, California, following guitarist Dave Mustaine's departure from Metallica. Currently, Megadeth has a total of 16 studio albums. So, Megadeth is definitely a band that came out strong out of the gate with a number of classic albums, then went into a more mainstream route with some success, but then had a really hard time holding on. Euthanasia and Cryptic Writings certainly had their moments, but not exceptionally strong releases. Then a few garbage albums, followed by albums that ranged from okay to actually pretty good. But for the ranking, it seems that those recent albums couldn't save the numbers, and so I've got Megadeth at 66%, which makes me barely a fan. And I guess that's about right, and kind of sad to say. But Dystopia and The Sick, The Dying, and the Dead are pretty good releases, so maybe continuing on that path will redeem the band for me over time. We'll see. Next is Anthrax, formed in 1981 in Queens, New York. And like Megadeth, they too are a cornerstone band in the early thrash metal movement. Currently, Anthrax has a total of 11 studio albums. So the Anthrax catalog is a bit of a strange beast. You've got a few strong records, then an okay one, followed by a couple more solid releases, then a couple stinkers, then an okay one, and then 2 once more strong albums. So a bit all over the place for me. And probably unlike other listeners, I don't feel as strongly about State of Euphoria, as it always had a number of weak tracks on it for me. And of the John Bush era records, I only found Stomp 442 and Volume 8 The Threat Is Real to be garbage, with Sound of White Noise being rather good, and We've Come For You All being a tad underrated. But it's undeniable that when Joey came back, so did the quality of the records. I mean, Worship Music and For All Kings have some killer material on them. So given the roller coaster ride that is their album ranking, Anthrax comes in at 73%. So at this point, I'm a casual fan, but I'm optimistic that the percentage could improve with future releases. Next up is Slayer, formed in 1981 in Huntington Park, California. The band is considered one of the big four of thrash metal alongside Megadeth, Anthrax, and another band we'll discuss shortly. Slayer also had a profound influence on the death metal scene of the 1980s and early 1990s. The band has a total of 11 studio albums in their catalog. So I feel like Slayer has never been consistent since Seasons in the Abyss. I mean, I thought Divine Intervention was decent and had a few good tracks, but wasn't really mind-blowing. Then the abysmal Cover Tunes record came out, and the studio album immediately following it wasn't particularly good, aside from Disciple, which is otherwise a killer song. Then a bit of an up and down for the remaining 3 albums, with World Painted Blood the best of the 3. Would have been nice if Slayer went out a little stronger than Repentless, which has some moments but also suffers from a bit of sameness. In fact, if you erased the albums from the 1980s and the early 1990s, I might not have even noticed this band in modern times. Overall, I'm far more excited about the classic era material, and so Slayer ranks at about 68% for me, making me barely a fan, but only a couple points away from casual fan. And that sounds about right. Next is Metallica, formed in 1981 in Los Angeles, but later moved to San Francisco, California. And needless to say, they ended up the biggest metal band on the planet. Currently, Metallica has a total of 11 studio albums. So yet another band that explodes in their classic era, just to relinquish their core sound later on. And yes, I do understand that there are Metallica fans who unquestionably love everything this band puts out, including cover tunes, symphonic renditions, and Lulu. But I just can't. Even if the 1980s output of this band is amazing and groundbreaking and classic, and I'll even toss in the Black Album for good measure for what it is, it just seems like Metallica went off the rails come the late 1990s with a trio of confused, inconsistent, and occasionally cringy albums. A bit of a quasi-comeback happens with 2008's Death Magnetic, but by then it's clear that the glory days are just long gone. I do feel that these last 3 albums, which also include Hardwired to Self-Destruct and 72 Seasons, have a few solid tracks each, but if I'm constantly skipping around these albums just to hear something I like, it might mean that my fandom for this band is a bit limited. Just how limited, you might ask? Well, given the entirety of the catalog, my ranking for Metallica drops to a paltry 59%, so as you might have guessed, not really a fan. With only a single percentage point away from slipping into the casual fan category. At any rate, I'll stick with the classic albums, which are really what got them where they are in the first place. I mean, I find it really hard to believe that if they started their career with Load, Reload, and Saint Anger, that they would be as popular as they are now. But you know what? Let me know in the comments how you feel about all of that. Again, whole lot of my opinion here, so feel free to post below. So I gotta say, I'm very surprised by these numbers, but if I think about it, there is a whole lot to be said for having more consistent quality in a band catalog, or perhaps putting more albums out over a long period of time, or simply coming out of the gate incredibly strong and having the staying power to go the distance. And of course, factor in the post-early 90s period of that musical shift to grunge and alternative and what some of these bands chose to do in order to stay relevant, or simply to survive. I mean, a lot of bands had some questionable releases during this time, as we've already discussed. But in any case, a lot of factors to consider here. Also, I did want to mention that where you see bands with the same percentage, I had to make the call on where they'd go in relation to the others. So that's how I chose to break the ties. Pure favoritism. So this was definitely a fun little experiment. I mean, maybe it is useful to evaluate if a band is really worthy of your fandom, or if they simply have some amazing early albums in their catalog and then little to nothing else after that. At any rate, it definitely opened my eyes to some lingering appreciation I had for bands that might no longer earn it, while also helping me to appreciate catalogs that are far more consistent and thus well worth the praise. And I'm willing to bet that you might get something out of scrutinizing your own fan status for legacy acts. You should definitely give it a shot and then let me know if you were surprised by the results you got. Maybe some bands hold up, maybe others do not. You should definitely let me know that and anything else relevant in the comments below. And of course, if this is the only thing you've ever seen from my channel, it might be helpful to know that my name is Matt, This is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I do videos on classic and modern metal, as well as metal vinyl collecting. If you want to see a whole lot more of this material, you should definitely subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Also, maybe like this video and share out my others with some of your friends on social media. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.